CIA wanted to strike at the Soviet Union and, as a result, helped launch a chain of events that returned to the USA as terrorist networks, heroin, and a black market for weapons. On a July evening in 1979, the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, signed a directive that officially did not imply anything grandiose. $695,000. Medicines, non-military equipment, non-lethal support for people fighting against the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. A modest figure for a country accustomed to measuring its influence in aircraft carrier groups. But on that same day, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a note to the President. In it, he explained bluntly, this aid, in his opinion, would provoke a Soviet military intervention. In other words, Washington was deliberately planting a mine under Soviet foreign policy, calculating that Moscow would not be able to resist and would walk into the Afghan trap. 20 years later, Brzezinski would speak about this openly, without a shadow of regret. Thus began Operation Cyclone, the code name for the CIA program to arm and finance the Afghan Mujahideen, which stretched from 1979 to 1992 and entered history as one of the longest, most expensive and most destructive secret operations of the Central Intelligence Agency in all its existence. Political start. Carter's decision and the logic of making the USSR its own Vietnam. To understand why this became possible at all, one must return to the atmosphere of 1979. The Soviet Union looked like a force that could not be stopped. Iran had just undergone a revolution that resulted in an anti-American regime. Nicaragua had gone to the Sandinistas. In Afghanistan, a pro-Soviet regime of the People's Democratic Party was in power, brutal, unstable, but oriented toward Moscow. Washington strategists looked at the map and saw, if the USSR could consolidate control over Afghanistan, the Soviet presence would move directly closer to the Persian Gulf and the Pakistani border. Brzezinski, a Pole by origin, a man with a biographically fixed hostility towards Soviet expansion, saw an opportunity in the Afghan chaos. He supported an idea that could be called a geopolitical provocation, to arm those who were already fighting against the Kabul regime, force the USSR to intervene, and turn Afghanistan into a Soviet Vietnam. The words were chosen intentionally. The American trauma of the Vietnam War had not yet healed, and Brzezinski proposed a mirror scenario. Let Moscow now find out what it means to lead an endless anti-guerrilla campaign in a mountainous country with a hostile population. Carter signed the first directive on July 3, 1979, more than 5 months before Soviet troops crossed the Afghan border. This is a fundamentally important fact that remained in the shadows for a long time. The official version of events for decades sounded like this. The US was forced to respond to the Soviet invasion that began on December 24, 1979. In reality, American support for the Afghan rebels preceded the invasion. Washington was not reacting, it was provoking. In January 1998, Brzezinski gave an interview to the French magazine Le Nouvel Observateur. He admitted everything directly. The reality, carefully guarded until now, is completely different. Indeed, it was on July 3, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive on secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And it was on that day that I wrote a note to the President, in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid would provoke a Soviet military intervention. Another fact is also noteworthy, which remained almost unnoticed. This interview appeared in 2 versions of the magazine. The one distributed within the USA, with the exception of the copy in the Library of Congress, did not contain Brzezinski's interview at all. French readers learned the truth. American ones, for the most part, did not. Such things happen. When Soviet troops finally entered Afghanistan in late December 1979, Brzezinski's strategic calculation received confirmation, and the operation changed scale sharply. Non-lethal support became lethal. Financing, which started with $695,000, grew to $20 to $30 million a year by 1980. Under Reagan, the flywheel accelerated. By 1984, the annual budget of the operation reached $200 million, and in 1987 it reached its peak, $630 million annually. Over the entire existence of the program, American taxpayers invested about $3 billion in it. More than $2 billion more passed through separate channels in the form of weapons, logistics, and training. Reagan raised the stakes not only in money. In 1985, his administration officially proclaimed support for anti-Soviet resistance movements around the world, the so-called Reagan Doctrine. After that, there was no longer any need to hide American weapons under foreign labels. The war against the USSR in Afghanistan turned into an almost open ideological campaign. High-ranking Pentagon official Michael Pillsbury successfully promoted the delivery of American weaponry directly, including the very weapon that would subsequently become one of the main headaches for American intelligence for decades to come. The goal of the operation was formulated somewhat more broadly than just exhausting the Soviet army. It was assumed that the Afghan conflict would tie up Soviet military resources that otherwise could have been deployed against the increasingly restless Eastern European satellite states. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, countries where pressure was accumulating beneath the surface of the Soviet order. Brzezinski saw Afghanistan as part of a great game. The consensus of the US intelligence community in 1978 to 1979, according to former CIA analyst Bruce Riedel, was that Moscow will not intervene by force even if it becomes likely that the Kalk government is about to collapse. In other words, part of the American analysts were not at all sure that a Soviet invasion was inevitable. The initial support for the Mujahideen, according to this version, pursued another goal as well: improving relations with Pakistan, which was nervous about the Soviet presence at its northern borders. Pakistan was needed as a strategic partner, and the Afghan operation gave it exactly what it wanted: American weapons, money, and political cover for playing in its own regional backyard. One way or another, the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan, and the machine began to work. The question of whether this was a brilliant strategic operation or an adventure with unpredictable consequences will occupy historians for a long time. The answer, apparently, depends on what time horizon is taken as the starting point. How the Afghan corridor worked. The CIA, the Pakistani ISI, and allies on both sides of the shadow. Imagine a warehouse somewhere on the outskirts of Karachi in the early 1980s. Boxes of weapons arrive by sea. Chinese, Egyptian, produced in Warsaw Pact countries. The documents, if they exist at all, speak of one recipient, but in reality the chain of transfer looks completely different. Pakistani military trucks pick up the boxes. Part goes north to the Afghan border. Part settles along the way. No one keeps exact records. No one is supposed to. That is the point. Somewhere in the port, a loader in flip-flops smoked and watched as another box with markings he could not read rolled past him. He was paid for the shift. What was inside was none of his business. Such was the operation on a human level. Countless people, each of whom did their small piece of work and did not see the whole. The structure of the Afghan operation was built on a principle that the intelligence community calls plausible deniability. The US was not supposed to be visible directly. Weapons had to look non-American. Training as non-American. Money had to pass through so many intermediate links that the chain could not be traced back to Washington. This is precisely why Pakistan was needed, as a buffer zone, as an operational base, as the main channel. The key partner of the CIA became the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI. It was through it that everything passed: weapons, money, instructions. The ISI selected the groups that would receive support. The ISI distributed resources among commanders. The ISI trained fighters. By the beginning of 1986, this infrastructure allowed for the annual training of 16,000 to 18,000 Mujahideen militants. This was not a secret operation in the usual sense of the word. This was effectively a parallel army created by other people's hands. The regime of General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, who came to power in Pakistan as a result of a 1977 military coup, accepted the American proposal with enthusiasm, but on his own terms. Zia himself determined which of the Afghan commanders was worthy of support. His preferences were unambiguous: Islamic fundamentalists, commanders with jihadist ties, people who fought not just against Soviet occupation, but in the name of a certain understanding of Islam, akin to that which was cultivated in Pakistani madrasas. Of the 7 Mujahideen groups that enjoyed the support of Zia's government, 4 professed Islamic fundamentalism. And it was they who received the majority of the financing. The CIA knew about this. To a certain extent, the CIA agreed with this, or at least did not provide enough resistance to change the alignment. The argument was pragmatic. Fundamentalists fight better. They are motivated not just by patriotism, but by religious conviction. Against Soviet tanks, this mattered. In the short term, it mattered. Howard Hart, who headed the Islamabad CIA station from May 1981 to mid-1984, was a man with unconventional methods. He called for the establishment of a Pakistani bounty for killed or captured Soviet soldiers. His successors were not behind in ingenuity. Gust Avrakotos, who headed the CIA task force on Afghanistan, praised the Pakistani system of incentivizing Mujahideen commanders, a system based on the volume of surrendered Soviet belt buckles, specifically buckles. The pragmatism of war took the most bizarre forms. CIA Director William J. Casey did not limit himself to office management. He secretly and repeatedly travelled to Pakistan for personal meetings with the ISI officers who directly led the Mujahideen. According to available data, he personally observed partisan training at least once. And it was Casey, according to Steve Cole's testimony, who amazed his Pakistani hosts by proposing something that went far beyond the agreed operation: to take the Afghan war to enemy territory, into the Soviet Union itself. The Pakistani military, by all appearances, received this idea with astonishment. The scale of American ambitions clearly exceeded their expectations. The operation also had a third dimension, which is spoken of much less frequently. Zia instructed the ISI to establish contact with the Israeli Mossad. Intelligence offices were created in the embassies of Israel and Pakistan in Washington, where the CIA, ISI, MI6 and Mossad jointly coordinated the operation. Israel entered this scheme with a specific asset: captured Soviet weapons. During the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Israelis captured large stockpiles of Soviet weaponry: assault rifles, missiles, artillery. Now, these weapons were secretly sold to the CIA and sent to Afghanistan. Pakistan and Israel, two countries that at that period had no diplomatic relations with each other, collaborated closely within this scheme, and the Pakistani military received generous Israeli armaments. The principle of plausible deniability worked at all levels. Soviet weapons in the hands of Afghan partisans pointed neither to Washington nor to Tel Aviv, nor to Islamabad. Who financed and covered the operation? Saudi Arabia, China, MI6, and the BCCI banking circuit. The financial architecture of Operation Cyclone was arranged so that not a single thread led directly to the American government. The CIA was the brain and coordinator, but money flowed from many sources. And this multiplicity was not an accident, but a design. Saudi Arabia agreed to a condition that in other circumstances would have looked exotic: to match dollar for dollar the sums that the CIA sent to the Mujahideen. Every American dollar invested in the operation was automatically doubled by Saudi money. Riyadh had its own motives. The Soviet presence in Afghanistan was perceived as a threat to the Islamic world, and support for jihad against atheistic communists fit perfectly into the Saudi religious political agenda. The bin Laden family, which owned a large construction company with close ties to the Saudi establishment, existed in this same space, although direct lines between Saudi state financing and specific people who subsequently became symbols of terror are much harder to trace than some conspiracy versions claim. China also participated in the scheme by supplying weapons. Chinese Type 56 rifles, a clone of the Soviet AK-47, went to Afghanistan through the Pakistani channel. This gave Beijing the opportunity to annoy Moscow using other people's hands without entering into a direct confrontation. British intelligence, MI6, conducted its own secret operations in parallel with the American ones. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher enthusiastically supported a tough stance against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, although British intelligence, by some estimates, believed that the CIA was unnecessarily raising the alarm about the Soviet threat to Pakistan. MI6 supplied the Afghan resistance with limpet mines, explosives, walkie-talkies, intelligence data, and about 50 blowpipe missile launchers with 300 missiles. The Special Air Service, SAS, gave resistance fighters combat training both inside Afghanistan and beyond its borders. But the darkest page of the operation's financial history remains the BCCI Bank, Bank of Credit and Commerce International. CIA Director William Casey met with the bank's founder and president, Agha Hassan Abedi. BCCI was the ideal tool for operations that could not be conducted through regular financial channels. A bank registered in Luxembourg with offices around the world, with clients ranging from drug lords to special services, with practically zero transparency. In 1991, Senators John Kerry and Hank Brown presented a report exposing numerous links between the CIA and this institution, which laundered money on an unprecedented scale. The report was devastating. BCCI was discredited by the international banking community and soon ceased operations. But the money that passed through its accounts, it had already done its job. Inside the US, specific politicians promoted and protected the operation. Congressman from Texas, Charlie Wilson, was perhaps the most colorful figure in this story. A man who loved parties, knew how to knock out budgets, and personally traveled to Pakistan to see how things were going. He built personal relationships with ISI officers and Pakistani politicians. Gust Avrakotos, the CIA regional director, became an operational partner for Wilson, a man who could convert political will into concrete deliveries. Young CIA officer Michael J. Vickers built the supply strategy, striving to maximize the damage inflicted on Soviet troops. Senator Gordon Humphrey, Deputy Secretary of Defense Fred Ickley, and William Casey pressed the financing pedal annually, achieving ever larger appropriations. Congress, in its turn, allocated a budget for the Afghan operations that exceeded any previous secret programs. In the 1986 to 1987 fiscal years, $1.1 billion combined, $470 million and $630 million respectively. This was not a secret program in the usual sense of the word. It was a state project with state financing, simply implemented through tools that allowed for maintaining distance between Washington and the Afghan mountains. CIA Director Casey, among other things, initiated propaganda operations inside Soviet Central Asia. The distribution of books about Soviet atrocities in Uzbekistan among the predominantly Muslim population of the southern republics of the USSR. The idea was to ignite nationalist and religious sentiments in the Soviet underbelly, to open a second front, invisible but potentially destructive. What the Mujahideen were armed with, from old rifles to Stinger and other deliveries. December 1979. The first batch of weapons sent by the CIA to the Afghan Mujahideen contained antique British Lee Enfield rifles, weapons that were several decades old, weapons from which they fought in a different era. Caution was evident in this choice. It could be weapons of any origin, in no way pointing to Washington. A little more than 6 years passed, and in September 1986, American FIM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense systems appeared in the hands of Afghan partisans. This was a qualitative transition of a different order. The Stinger allowed an infantryman to destroy a helicopter, and Soviet Mi-24 helicopters were one of the main tools for suppressing the Mujahideen. The delivery of Stingers changed the balance in the air. Soviet aviation lost its former impunity. Losses began to grow. From a military point of view, this was perhaps the most effective single delivery of the entire operation. Between these two poles, the Lee Enfield and the Stinger, lay 7 years of continuous arms build-up. Early deliveries after the escalation under Reagan in 1981 included Chinese Type 56 rifles, Egyptian and Pakistani small arms, recoilless guns and mortars. By 1985, the program had delivered more than 75,000 tons of weapons, a figure that is difficult to comprehend abstractly. Imagine a continuous stream of ships, planes and trucks moving toward the Afghan-Pakistani border over several years. That is closer to reality. In total, about 2,300 Stinger missiles were delivered to Afghanistan. Each of them is a weapon capable of hitting an aircraft. Each of them, remaining in circulation after the end of the war, represented a potential threat not only to military aircraft, but also to civilian airliners. Long-range rockets, originally of Chinese or Egyptian origin, were used in the bombing of Kabul starting from 1985. They killed and maimed civilians. This was known. This was taken into account as an acceptable price for the operation. The principle of plausible deniability dictated specific limitations in the choice of armaments. Throughout the period while this rule was strictly in force, exclusively Soviet or Soviet-style weapons were supplied, trophy stockpiles bought from Israel after the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian and Pakistani weapons of Soviet designs, Chinese copies of Soviet systems. The logic was ironclad. An Afghan partisan with a Soviet assault rifle is a partisan from whom this weapon came from somewhere. An Afghan partisan with an American weapon system is evidence of American participation, which in 1980 to 1985 Washington tried with all its might to avoid. After the proclamation of the Reagan Doctrine in 1985, the need for this disguise disappeared. It was then that American weapons, Stingers first and foremost, went directly. High-ranking Pentagon official Michael Pillsbury successfully pushed through this decision despite the doubts of part of the intelligence community. Some CIA officers feared exactly what subsequently happened. The weapons would fall into the wrong hands. The British side made its contribution in a separate stream. In addition to blowpipe missiles, London passed explosives, limpet mines, walkie-talkies, and intelligence data to the Afghan resistance. The SAS trained fighters in sabotage tactics and raid operations. Arms deliveries through the Pakistani corridor were accompanied from the very beginning by a problem that everyone saw, but no one could or wanted to truly solve. Weapons arriving in Karachi were often sold on the local market instead of being sent to the Afghan partisans. Karachi, as a result, in the words of eyewitnesses, became one of the most violent cities in the world, saturated with weapons, money from drug trafficking, and all accompanying consequences. This was one of the first visible results of the operation, manifesting even before its end, right in the country of the ally. Whom they bet on, Why money went to more radical groups rather than moderate commanders. In the mountains of Panjshir, a commander operated whom his supporters called the Lion of Panjshir. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a Tajik by origin, a man with the reputation of one of the most effective military leaders of the entire Afghan resistance. His guerrilla warfare tactics in the Panjshir Valley bled several Soviet offensives. Western journalists, reaching his positions at the risk of their lives, returned with enthusiastic reports. MI6 valued him. British intelligence annually sent 2 of its officers and military instructors to Massoud. The CIA established limited contact with him starting in 1984, but treated him with reserved skepticism. Why? More on that below. The result of this skepticism is expressed in one figure. Despite his reputation, Massoud received only 8 Stinger missiles, and none of them until 1991, that is, effectively already after Soviet troops had left Afghanistan. This was not an accident or a bureaucratic error. It was the consequence of a conscious choice, made not so much by Langley, but by Islamabad. The Pakistani ISI ensured that Massoud received a negligible share of the total volume of supplies. Zia and his generals preferred commanders who shared their own understanding of Islam and politics. The main beneficiary of this choice was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, commander of the Islamic Party of Afghanistan, inspired by the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. According to expert estimates, it was he and his structures that received a disproportionately large share of CIA financing. His military effectiveness against Soviet troops was, to put it mildly, dubious, but his readiness to attack other Mujahideen commanders, including Massoud, was well documented. Hekmatyar fought against everyone and for himself. The CIA organized his trip to the USA. State Department official Zalmay Khalilzad received him. Hekmatyar was invited to a meeting with President Reagan. He refused to come. This small episode, the American side was ready to receive him in the White House and he simply didn't bother to show up, speaks of the balance of power more eloquently than any analytical reports. The second key figure in this row was Jalaluddin Haqqani, a commander operating in the Khost area, a man with a reputation as an exceptionally effective warrior. CIA agents paid him direct cash rewards. Subsequently, his name would become a household name in a completely different context. The Haqqani network would turn into one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the region. In parallel, Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Armitage regularly met with representatives of the Mujahideen, especially with Burhanuddin Rabbani. The head of the Islamabad station, Howard Hart, built personal relationships with Abdul Haq, which ultimately led to the Afghans' meetings with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Contacts were multi-level, covered different groups, and were built through different channels. Whether conscious or not, the preference for fundamentalists over moderates had its own logic within the operation. Fundamentalists were more motivated, more disciplined within their ideology, less prone to compromises with the Soviet side. From the point of view of short-term military effectiveness, this made a certain sense. From the point of view of what would happen after the withdrawal of Soviet troops, this was the planting of a mine with a delayed action fuse. But nobody in 1983 seriously thought about 2001. US Special Envoy Edmund McWilliams warned as early as the late 1980s, the ISI in collusion with Hekmatyar was working to establish an Islamist regime in Afghanistan by killing or intimidating opponents, thereby making a mockery of US claims of supporting Afghan self-determination. The reaction of his superiors was telling. Raffles' successor, Robert B. Oakley, and Milton Bearden did not consider this warning on its merits. Instead, they worked on undermining trust in McWilliams through an internal investigation which, however, did not reveal anything compromising about him personally. An inconvenient person with inconvenient conclusions. A standard bureaucratic reaction to what it does not want to hear. The invisible infrastructure of war. Training, logistics, direct contacts with field leaders, and propaganda. Over the decade of the operation in Afghanistan, an infrastructure of secret war was created on such a scale that had no precedence in the post-war history of the American intelligence community. This was not just a supply of weapons, it was a system encompassing training, logistics, financing, information operations, and direct human ties with commanders on the ground. Training of fighters took place in camps on Pakistani territory, and the ISI managed this process as the main operator. The CIA officially kept its distance. According to Peter Bergen, not a single American trained or had direct contact with the Mujahideen. The cautious CIA numbered fewer than 10 operatives in the region. The agency feared it would be accused of direct interference. But this cautious distancing from training bases did not mean the absence of ties with specific people on another level. By 1986, 16,000 to 18,000 fighters underwent training annually through this infrastructure. Sir Martin Ewens estimated that up to 35,000 Arab Afghans, foreign volunteers arriving from all over the Islamic world, could have undergone military training in Pakistan during the years up to 1988, at a projected cost of $800 million. These people came from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Sudan, Yemen, and returned home as trained militants with real war experience. No one seriously calculated what they would do after returning. Logistics functioned at the intersection of military operation and commercial transport. Trucks and mules supplied by the CIA for transporting weapons to Afghanistan were used for other purposes as well. Supply routes through the Khyber Pass and other mountain passes became well-oiled corridors over the years of war through which everything moved: weapons, money, people, opium, in both directions. The propaganda dimension of the operation often remains in the shadow of the military and financial one. Meanwhile, the CIA and the State Department were criticized for publishing textbooks intended for Afghan children. These materials instilled hatred toward foreigners and non-Afghan Muslims, used jihadist rhetoric and images of violence as a pedagogical tool. Children who grew up on these textbooks subsequently made up part of that generation that gave the Taliban its first fighters. In parallel, the CIA conducted propaganda operations in Soviet Central Asia, distributing through various channels books about Soviet atrocities in Uzbekistan aimed at the Muslim population of the southern republics of the USSR. The idea was to create internal pressure that would complement external military pressure. Another little-known fact: in mid-1979, even before the Soviet invasion, the initial financing, in the amount of about $575,000, included the supply to Pakistan of 2 radio broadcasting stations for use by the rebels. Information warfare was conducted from the very beginning, in parallel with the military one. Al-Qaeda, literally the database, was originally a computer file of thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with the help of the CIA to defeat the Russians. This is how one of the analysts described it. The formulation is harsh and debatable in its details, but it captures the real mechanism. In the course of the operation, a database of fighters, their contacts, and their capabilities was created. A database that continued to exist after the war ended. The infrastructure of war survived the war itself. Camps, routes, ties, money, weapons. None of this vanished the moment the last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge and returned home. It remained, and it began to live its own life, a life that no one in Langley or Washington had planned. In the late 1980s, Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, concerned about the growing strength of the Islamist movement, told President George H.W. Bush directly, "You are creating a Frankenstein." Bush, as far as is known, listened to her. The policy did not change. The March coup of 1990, an attempt by Khalqist defector Shahnawaz Tanai to seize power in alliance with Hekmatyar, was presumably financed by bin Laden. By that time, bin Laden was no longer an unknown volunteer. He was a man with money, ties, and a reputation among the Arab militants who had gone through the Afghan school. Steve Coll wrote that CIA archives do not contain any records of direct contact between a CIA officer and bin Laden in the 1980s, and added with irony, if the CIA really had contact with bin Laden in the 1980s and subsequently concealed it, then it did so excellently. Peter Bergen formulated it differently. The real problem is not that the CIA helped bin Laden in the 1980s, but that the agency simply had no idea of his possible significance. Perhaps this is the most accurate characteristic of Operation Cyclone as a system. It did what it was ordered to do, and did it effectively within the given parameters. But outside of those parameters, in that space where long-term consequences are created, no one systematically looked. When the operation concluded, when Soviet troops left, when Washington switched attention to other problems, the Afghan infrastructure of war, weapons, people, money, ideology, continued to exist. And it began to move in directions that its creators did not foresee or did not want to foresee. The CIA succeeded in creating chaos, but never developed a plan for ending it. Section 2. Dark Aftertaste: How the Blowback Went Beyond Afghanistan. When in February 1989 the last column of Soviet armoured vehicles crossed the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya, and General Boris Gromov, the last of all, walked across it on foot under the cameras, Western capitals perceived this as a victory. In Washington, London and Riyadh, people involved in Operation Cyclone could allow themselves satisfaction. The Soviet Union did exactly what was expected of it. It entered, got stuck, bled out and left. Afghanistan became its Vietnam, exactly as Brzezinski had planned 10 years earlier. The problem was that the war did not end. It simply changed form. The vacuum after the USSR's withdrawal, why the war did not conclude but disintegrated into a new one. Najibullah's government, the pro-Soviet regime which, according to Western analysts' calculations, was supposed to collapse immediately after the withdrawal of Soviet troops, held on unexpectedly long. 3 years. As long as Moscow continued to finance and supply it, it functioned. This was inconvenient. Officially admitting it was even more inconvenient. When in late 1991 the Soviet Union disintegrated and financing dried up, the regime collapsed in 1992, following the cessation of American aid to the Mujahideen as well. In the archives of those years, there are minutes of CIA meetings where officers discuss, quite routinely, in passing, how best to organize payments to one commander or another. The tone of these documents is roughly the same as that of corporate memorandums on logistics. No drama, work. The US participated in planning the capture of Jalalabad jointly with the ISI as early as 1989, immediately after the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The operation assumed that Mujahideen forces would take the city and thereby create a bridgehead for a further offensive. It failed. The Mujahideen could not withstand the Afghan government army in a conventional positional war. They were magnificent guerrillas, but regular war required something else. The defeat at Jalalabad became the first symptom that the winners of the Afghan jihad did not form either a state or an army. They formed a multitude of armed groups with incompatible interests. When Najibullah finally fell in April 1992, power in Kabul did not pass to anyone specifically. It disintegrated among factions between Massoud and Rabbani from the north, Hekmatyar from the southeast, the Uzbek field commander Dostum, and Hazara units of Hizb-i Wadat. Each of these forces laid claim to Kabul. No one could hold it alone. Najibullah tried to take refuge in the UN representation. He was found there several years later by the Taliban. His body was hung on a pole near the presidential palace. Cigarettes were tied to his fingers. What followed was called the Afghan Civil War, but this name hid the real nature of what was happening. It was not a conflict between two sides with clear positions, but a multilateral armed clash of groups that changed allies, betrayed each other, shelled the civilian population of Kabul with heavy artillery, and caused the city more destruction than a decade of Soviet occupation. The residents of Kabul learned to determine by sound whose rockets were flying, Hekmatyar's or Massoud's. The difference was not very fundamental, but still, according to estimates, about 50,000 people died during the years of civil war in Kabul itself. Financing of Operation Cyclone continued after 1989, while the Mujahideen fought against the PDPA during the Civil War. Washington did not just supply the partisans during the years of Soviet occupation. It continued to pump money and weapons into the country for several more years, supporting those it considered allies. This meant that weapons continued to enter a system that had already begun to fall apart from within. Special Envoy Edmund McWilliams warned as early as the late 1980s that the ISI, in collusion with Hekmatyar, was working toward establishing an Islamist regime through murder and intimidation of opponents. His warning was ignored. Moreover, an intrigue was started against him personally within the agency. The story of a man who turned out to be right is a familiar story. When his words were confirmed, it was already too late to ignore them. The power vacuum that formed after the departure of the USSR and the collapse of Najibullah was not an accidental failure. It was programmed by the very logic of Operation Cyclone. The CIA created tools of war, but not tools of peace. It financed commanders, but not state institutions. It supplied weapons, but did not concern itself with what would happen when there was no one left to fight, or when there were too many opponents. Furthermore, US interest in Afghanistan dropped sharply after the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The country fell out of the list of priorities. Resources, attention, political will, all of this moved to other points on the map. Afghanistan was left alone with its weapons, its commanders, and its ruined economy. Over a decade of war, 1 million people died. 5 to 6 million fled to Pakistan and Iran. The country's infrastructure was destroyed. The state, as such, ceased to exist. It was an ideal incubator for what came next. From Mujahideen to new centers of power, the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and Al-Qaeda as heirs to the conflict. The lack of oversight in the distribution of weapons and military aid led to numerous well-armed Islamist groups finding themselves in a struggle for power after the Soviet withdrawal. This is a known fact, but it is important to understand the mechanism, not just state the result. Hekmatyar received the most. His Islamic Party of Afghanistan was the main recipient of financing through the Pakistani channel throughout almost the entire operation. CIA analysts who worked with him directly describe him in their memoirs in different ways. Some as a calculating politician, others as a person with an absolutely glassy gaze who smiles exactly when it is profitable and not a second longer. By the time the Soviet troops left, he had enough weapons, money, and fighters to claim Kabul. But he did not have enough legitimacy to hold power. Massoud and other commanders did not intend to submit to him.
As a result, Hekmatyar shelled Kabul with rockets. The very long-range rockets supplied by the CIA now fell on city blocks, killing civilians. Haqqani built differently. Jalaluddin Haqqani, who received direct cash rewards from CIA agents, created in the Khost area not just an armed group, but an entire network, with financial flows, with madrasas, with recruitment infrastructure, with trans-border ties. One CIA officer who worked with him in the 1980s later characterized Haqqani in an interview as an absolutely magnificent operational partner. He said this without irony. After the end of the Afghan war, this network did not dissolve. It reoriented itself. His son Sirajuddin would subsequently turn it into one of the most dangerous structures in the region, the Haqqani network, recognized as a terrorist organization, responsible for numerous attacks on American and NATO troops already in the 21st century. The Taliban arose from another source, although it fed from the same stream. Students of Afghan madrasas on Pakistani territory, madrasas that in the 1980s were filled with refugees, orphaned children of war, young people without a profession and without a future, but with weapons all around and with a radical religious ideology at hand. Among these children were those who grew up seeing adult men walk with a Kalashnikov as ordinarily as with a staff for livestock. Mohammed Omar, a one-eyed mullah from Uruzgan province, became the symbol and leader of a movement that in 1994 began to rapidly seize control over the southern provinces of Afghanistan. By 1996, the Taliban took Kabul. Local residents described the appearance of the Taliban roughly the same way. Suddenly, it became quiet. This was unusual. The weapons with which the Taliban fought were in significant part from the stockpiles of the Operation Cyclone era. The training that its commanders received
often went back to those same Pakistani camps. The ideological infrastructure, madrasas, money, religious networks, was fed from the same sources that the American-Saudi-Pakistani coalition activated in the 1980s. The Taliban was not a direct creation of the CIA. That statement would be an oversimplification. But it was a product of the environment that Operation Cyclone actively created and cultivated. Bin Laden's path into this story was special. He did not receive money from the CIA directly. There are no records of direct contacts in Langley's archives. He acted within the framework of secret operations of Saudi intelligence, outside the immediate field of vision of American intelligence. His organization MAK, Maktab al-Khidamat, was engaged in the recruitment and financing of Arab volunteers for the Afghan jihad. MAK was supported by the Pakistani ISI, the very main channel of the CIA for conducting the secret war. Bin Laden and Islamic militants from Egypt, Pakistan, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestinian refugee camps existed in one and the same ecosystem fed from the same sources. Al-Qaeda, literally the database, was originally a computer file of thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with the help of the CIA to defeat the Russians. When Russia left, this file was not deleted. It became the organizational basis for a new project, the project of global jihad, directed now against the West. Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin claim that there is no support in reliable sources for the assertion that the CIA financed bin Laden or other Arab volunteers directly. Peter Bergen agreed in essence. The real problem is not that the CIA helped bin Laden in the 1980s, but that the agency simply had no idea of his possible significance. This distinction is important and honest, but it does not remove the broader question. The CIA did not finance bin Laden. The CIA created the environment in which bin Laden became possible. Among other veterans of the Afghan campaign, who subsequently became part of terrorist history, was Sheikh Abd al-Rahman, known for his role in the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Saeed Sheikh allegedly wired $100,000 to September 11th hijacker Mohammed Atta shortly before the attacks. The lines here are not direct and not always documented, but they exist. You are creating a Frankenstein, how the alliance with radicals became a political warning. In the late 1980s, Benazir Bhutto, the Pakistani Prime Minister, told President George H.W. Bush, "You are creating a Frankenstein." Bhutto understood what she was talking about. She managed a country that was the main operational channel for Operation Cyclone, and saw from the inside exactly what was being created. Armed groups with a jihadist ideology, trained for war, with combat experience and money. Groups that would not disappear after the war ended. Bush listened to her. Nothing changed. Warnings sounded even earlier and from other sources. Special Envoy McWilliams warned about the ISI's role in promoting Hekmatyar, even when Soviet troops were just leaving. He was removed from the case. Part of the CIA analysts doubted the expediency of providing stingers to Islamic fundamentalists. Their voices were drowned out in the pressure from supporters of expanding the program. One of the officers who spoke against it later said that they looked at him roughly, like a person who says at a party that the music is too loud. The Reagan administration as a whole rejected the very framing of the question of what would happen after the Soviet departure. When Gorbachev proposed a compromise, a reformed Soviet presence in Afghanistan, power sharing, a phased withdrawal of troops in exchange for the cessation of American aid to the Mujahideen, Washington rejected this in favour of a total victory. A total victory was achieved. Its price was discovered later. General Zia, who built the Afghan operation from inside Pakistan, was not a naive executor of American plans. He had his own agenda and saw in the Islamic fundamentalists not a temporary tool, but a long-term political asset. He wanted to have a regime in Kabul loyal to Islamabad, and preferred to see in power people with jihadist ties who depended on Pakistani support, rather than independent commanders like Massoud, who relied on their own foundations. Zia himself warned Hekmatyar with characteristic directness. It was Pakistan that made him an Afghan leader, and it was Pakistan that could, with equal success, destroy him if he continued to behave badly. This was the language of a patron to a dependent, without unnecessary words. The irony is that the alliance with radicals, which seemed a temporary tactical solution to American strategists, turned out to be a long-term project for the radicals themselves. They did not intend to lay down their arms. The question was only against whom. Chalmers Johnson, who developed the concept of blowback, the backstrike of secret operations against those who initiated them, called Operation Cyclone, the American event most associated with this idea. Blowback, in his understanding, is not a conspiracy and not an accident. It is a systemic consequence of secret operations, the consequences of which, by definition, cannot be completely controlled, because the operations themselves cannot be publicly acknowledged. When an action cannot be acknowledged, a consequence cannot be answered for. Afghan heroin and the global drug trade, when the war began to feed itself. When in 1979 the CIA began to supply trucks and mules for transporting weapons to Afghanistan, no one in the service instructions prescribed exactly what would be transported by this transport on the return journey. This was an understandable gap. The war required logistics. Logistics required transport. What Mujahideen commanders did with the transport in their time free from military tasks, this, strictly speaking, was not part of the CIA officers' tasks. On the return journey, the trucks carried opium. The Afghan-Pakistani border zone, by the beginning of the 1980s, turned into one of the largest centres of heroin production and processing in the world. Laboratories were located along the border. The raw material, Afghan opium, flowed from the north. The finished heroin went west to Europe and east to the USA. In one of the State Department reports of 1986, one paragraph is devoted to this topic, at the end, after the analysis of the military situation. American officials admitted in 1990 that they failed to investigate or take measures against this drug operation. The point is not the lack of information. The point is priorities. The war against the USSR was more important than the war against drugs. And when these two wars entered into conflict, the second yielded. The CIA's main client, and simultaneously one of the region's leading drug lords, was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the very one whom the CIA brought to the United States, who came to a meeting with Reagan. The photograph has been preserved. This same man controlled the heroin laboratories along the Afghan-Pakistani border that provided up to half of the heroin consumed annually in the US and 3/4 in Western Europe. Transport supplied by the CIA for military needs was used, among other things, for transporting opium to these laboratories. The CIA and the State Department were criticized for direct relations with Hekmatyar, besides contact through the ISI, despite the fact that his ties to drug trafficking were not a secret. The official response to this criticism always boiled down roughly to one thing: war requires allies, and allies are different. By the moment the decade-long war concluded with the withdrawal of Soviet troops, Afghan heroin had seized 60% of the American market. In the 1970s, Afghanistan was not a significant source of heroin for the US. Over the decade of Operation Cyclone, this share grew to 60%. The operation did not create the drug trade intentionally, but it created conditions in which it flourished and did not take measures to limit it, because limitation would have threatened military priorities. Hundreds of thousands of Americans became addicted to heroin that passed through the Afghan-Pakistani corridor, built in part with American money and American logistics. The war against the Soviet Union partially financed itself through drug trafficking, and this method of self-financing left a trace on American streets. During the Civil War of the 1990s, opium production in Afghanistan only increased. Commanders fighting against each other needed money, and opium was the most accessible source. By the 1990s, the country produced about 70% of the world's opium. The Taliban, upon coming to power in 1996, initially banned production and indeed sharply reduced it in 2000 to 2001. But after the American invasion in 2001, opium production began to grow again, and by 2007, Afghanistan produced about 93% of the world's illegal opium. The road from Operation Cyclone to the current Afghan opium export is not direct and not one-dimensional, but it exists. Stinger without control, the black market for weapons, the failed buyback program, and weapons that did not disappear. About 2,300 Stinger missiles. That is exactly how many the CIA sent to Afghanistan. Each of them is a man-portable air defense system capable of hitting an aircraft at an altitude of up to 3.5 kilometers. Compact, relatively light, technically uncomplicated to use. When Soviet troops left, combat needs for Stingers decreased sharply. But the missiles did not go anywhere. They were distributed among a multitude of commanders, groups, and field structures throughout Afghanistan and the neighboring areas of Pakistan. There was no centralized accounting. No return mechanism existed. A weapon that cost about $20,000 to produce could be sold on the black market for $100,000, 5 times more than the purchase price. For a commander who needed money for the next round of civil war, this was an irresistible temptation. The CIA realized the scale of the problem not immediately, and then launched a buyback program. The agency offered Afghan commanders money in exchange for missiles. The initial buyback price was $70,000 per unit, lower than the black market price of $100,000. The logic of this arithmetic was against the program from the very beginning. One of the officers who participated in the buyback negotiations later described the meetings with commanders roughly like this. They nodded, drank tea, said goodbye very politely. The missiles remained with them. Congress allocated more than $65 million in secret funds over 3 years for the buyback program, roughly twice as much as the US originally paid for the missiles themselves. In 1993, the CIA turned to Congress, indicating that it required an additional $55 million. The motivation was candid. The failure to secure the missiles could lead to attacks on American civilian aircraft. The intelligence agency that had distributed anti-aircraft missiles to Islamic partisans was now spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to collect them back, and could not. In 1998, Felix Sater provided the CIA with the locations and serial numbers of approximately 10 Stingers held by the Northern Alliance. This was a grain of success against the background of the overall failure. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute recognized the buyback mission as a failure, due to the fundamental impossibility of tracking widely scattered weapons. About 100 Stingers, by estimates, were acquired by Iran. China, North Korea, and a number of other states also belong to the number of those to whom the acquisition of missiles from Afghan commanders is attributed. This means that American man-portable air defense systems settled in the arsenals of states that Washington counted among its adversaries. Some sources claim that the buyback program was secretly resumed after the American military intervention in Afghanistan in late 2001, out of fears that the remaining missiles could be used against American troops and helicopters. If this is so, then the situation acquires a special, bitter logic. American military personnel entered Afghanistan and discovered there, among other things, weapons supplied by American special services 2 decades earlier. The Stinger became the symbol of this entire story, the symbol of a weapon that escapes control. The CIA may be the copyright holder of this idea, but since then others have thought, hey, we can use this model. And that's where we are now. This referred to the model of arming non-state actors in other people's wars. A model that demonstrated its effectiveness in the short term and its catastrophic long-term consequences. A model that was subsequently applied in Libya, Syria, and other hotspots with similar results. The Pakistani boomerang, Karachi, corruption, and the use of Afghan experience in the Kashmir conflict. Pakistan was the main tool of Operation Cyclone. All weapons, all money, all logistics passed through it. The ISI managed the operation on the ground. The Pakistani military received generous financing and armaments, including from Israel, within the framework of secret trilateral cooperation. Pakistan emerged from the Afghan operation strengthened in military and financial respects and deeply changed internally. Karachi, the country's largest city, a port metropolis through which all the cargo with weapons went, became the first victim of this process. Weapons sent to Karachi by sea for subsequent transfer to the Afghan border often settled on the local market. Part was sold, part was misappropriated, part ended up in the hands of criminal structures. Karachi, by the mid-1980s, according to descriptions by eyewitnesses, became one of the most violent cities in the world, saturated with weapons, permeated with drug trafficking, torn apart by ethnic violence. Local journalists wrote about this. No one particularly reacted. The redirection of aid through Pakistan led to systemic corruption built into the very architecture of the operation. When huge sums of money and colossal quantities of weapons move through a country with opaque military structures and without control mechanisms, corruption is not an anomaly, it is a logical result. The ISI and the Pakistani military learned to work with these flows and to use them in their own interests. The experience gained by the ISI during Operation Cyclone, experience in training partisans, organizing supply, managing irregular formations, turned out to be too valuable to simply forget about after the end of the Afghan war.
The IS. I applied this experience in another place, in Kashmir. The Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan had a long history long before Operation Cyclone. But in the late 1980s to early 1990s, it acquired a new dimension. The ISI began to train Kashmiri militants using methods and infrastructure developed in the Afghan program. Militants who had gone through Afghan camps were transferred to Kashmir. Ideological narratives created for the Afghan jihad were adapted to the Kashmiri conflict. The American program created structures and competencies in Pakistan that were subsequently directed not against the USA, but against another country, India. This escalated one of the most dangerous regional conflicts in the world, in which both sides possessed nuclear weapons. The ISI received not just money and weapons from the American program, it received a model of secret war, which it applied independently, already without American approval and outside of American control. The BCCI Bank, which serviced the Afghan operation, was also used for operations related to the Kashmir conflict and other Pakistani intelligence projects. When it collapsed in 1991 under the pressure of international investigations, a picture was revealed of a global financial network that serviced the secret operations of several states simultaneously. Not one of these operations was officially acknowledged. The consequences of many of them were felt long after the bank's closure. Why Operation Cyclone became a classic example of blowback. Expert disputes, different assessments of success, and the price of victory. Historians and analysts still disagree in their assessments of Operation Cyclone. The range of opinions is wide, from recognition of the operation as a brilliant strategic success to qualifying it as one of the most catastrophic mistakes of American foreign policy in the 20th century. The truth, as often happens, depends on what exactly is considered success and on what time horizon. The long-term legacy of this program is extremely controversial. Many of its original architects consider it a success, and it certainly played a role in weakening the Soviet Union and possibly accelerating its ultimate collapse. This is an objective assessment. The USSR entered Afghanistan strong and emerged weakened. The Afghan war cost the Soviet economy tens of billions of rubles, cost the lives of approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers,
and delivered a serious blow to the military and political prestige of the USSR inside the country and abroad. It accelerated the systemic crisis that concluded with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Brzezinski, answering the question of whether he regretted the operation, framed the question in his own way. What is more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire, some stirred-up Muslims, or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? The argument is historical and, in its own way, convincing, if one accepts his time horizon and his system of values. The collapse of the USSR indeed meant the liberation of the peoples of Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. The Cold War indeed concluded. But some stirred-up Muslims is a formulation pronounced in January 1998, 3.5 years before September 11, 2001. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were still standing when Brzezinski gave that interview. The 3,000 people who would perish in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania on that September day were still alive. Some of them, at that moment, were likely riding the subway or drinking coffee. This changes nothing in the logic of Brzezinski's argument, but it is worth keeping in mind. On the other hand, the line between Operation Cyclone and the events of September 11th is not direct and not unambiguous. The CIA did not finance bin Laden directly. The agency did not train the hijackers. Operation Cyclone was not a conscious project for the creation of Al-Qaeda. This is fundamentally important for historical accuracy, and it does not remove the question of systemic consequences. The concept of blowback, developed by Chalmers Johnson, speaks not of a conspiracy and not of a direct cause and effect relationship. It says that secret operations generate consequences that, by definition, cannot be publicly acknowledged and, consequently, cannot be adequately taken into account when making political decisions. When an operation is classified, its results are also classified. When results are classified, there is no public accountability. When there is no public accountability, there is no incentive for a thorough calculation of long-term consequences. Operation Cyclone embodied this logic in its ultimate expression. The operation achieved its short-term goal. It created long-term consequences that its creators either did not foresee or chose to ignore. These consequences turned out to be global. Terrorist networks, heroin on American streets, a black market for weapons, instability in the space from Karachi to Kashmir and beyond. As for the CIA, its goal was simply to humiliate the Soviets by arming everyone who was ready to fight against them. The agency channeled cash and weapons to more than a dozen guerrilla groups, many of whom, even before the Soviet invasion, were conducting raids from the territory of Pakistan. Over many years after the Soviet departure from Afghanistan, most of these groups were still fighting among themselves for control of the country. The word simply in this quote carries all the semantic weight. The goal was simple. The execution was complex. The consequences turned out to be unpredictable, and it is precisely in this gap between a simple goal and unpredictable consequences that what Johnson called blowback lives. Najibullah's government collapsed in 1992, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the cessation of American aid, leaving Afghanistan a failed state in the grip of a multifaceted and destructive civil war. The collapse of the USSR, the victory of Operation Cyclone. The failed state, its consequence. The Civil War, its legacy. The Taliban, who came out of that civil war, its grandson. Weapons do not know when the war has ended. Fighters do not know when their services are no longer needed. Ideology does not disappear along with financing. And when 12 years after the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, American planes crashed into American skyscrapers, piloted by people raised in the very environment that Operation Cyclone partially created, this was not a conspiracy and not a coincidence. This was Blowback. Classic, textbook, predicted theoretically, and still not prevented.